That night, the suburban sky hung heavy with clouds, foretelling an impending storm. Madison stood by the living room window, a glass of red wine swirling idly in her hand, her gaze lost among the faint, blurry streetlights shimmering in the dark. Jack, as usual, was absent. Another business trip stretched out until the weekend. It was just her and Ethan in the large, cold house. A faint sound drifted down from upstairs, shattering the absolute silence. Madison flinched. Setting her wineglass on the table, she strained to listen. The noise was unfamiliar, neither the sound of footsteps nor the soft beat of music coming from Ethan's room. A strange curiosity tugged at her, pulling her toward the staircase. The glow from Ethan's room spilled through the slight crack in the door. Madison walked slowly, her bare feet gliding over the cold wooden floor, the soft creaks echoing beneath her. She paused at the doorway, intending to knock and announce her presence, but then she stopped. Through the narrow gap, the scene inside made her freeze. Ethan was sitting on the edge of his bed, his shoulders slightly hunched, holding something in his hands that she couldn't quite make out. The dim light of the bedside lamp cast his shadow long and stark, creating a blend of the real and the surreal. But it wasn't the sight that captivated her, it was the expression on his face. His features were weighed down by a sadness she hadn't seen before, his eyes fixed intently on the object in his hands, as if he were battling an intense internal struggle. She knew she shouldn't be standing there. Yet the vulnerability etched into his face, the fragile pain so openly displayed, rooted her to the spot. It was a side of Ethan she had never seen, one she doubted anyone else had ever witnessed. "Madison?" Ethan's voice broke the silence, snapping her back to reality. He had noticed her standing there. Madison froze, unsure of what to say, her fingers gripping the edge of the doorframe awkwardly. His gaze met hers, a mixture of surprise and a flicker of embarrassment. The object in his hands, a worn photo frame, was hastily set down on the bed as if he didn't want her to see it. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude," Madison finally managed, her voice shaky, betraying her attempt to appear calm. Ethan drew in a deep breath, his eyes shifting away from hers and returning to the frame. "It's fine. I didn't think you'd come up here." "What's the photo of?" Madison took a step closer, her voice softening. She didn't want to press him, but the image of him just moments ago had ignited a deep, almost instinctive curiosity. Ethan hesitated, his silence stretching as if he were debating whether to respond. Finally, he picked up the frame, his thumb brushing over the faded wooden edge. "It's my mum," he said, his voice low, almost distant. I don't know why, but I've been thinking about her a lot tonight." Madison felt a quiet ache stir in her chest. The restrained pain in his words resonated with something deep inside her. She stepped closer, her gaze falling on the photograph. It was of a young woman, her smile gentle as sunlight, though her eyes carried an unmistakable weight of introspection. Ethan looked so much like her, not only in his features but in the quiet melancholy reflected in his gaze. "You don't have to hide how you feel around me," Madison said softly. "Sometimes sharing can make things a little easier." Ethan let out a faint, bitter laugh, a smile flickering across his lips but vanishing just as quickly. "Do you really believe that, when you don't share anything with anyone yourself?" His words struck her like a sudden gust of wind, leaving her momentarily speechless. Ethan's piercing grey-blue eyes locked onto hers, as if peeling away the layers she had carefully built to protect herself. And in that moment, the air between them shifted, heavier, laden with something neither of them could define. It wasn't anger or judgment in his gaze. It was something deeper, something that made the space between them feel forbidden, like they had both wandered into a place neither of them had meant to find, but couldn't bring themselves to leave. Madison returned to the living room after her brief conversation with Ethan, but her mind refused to let go of the moment. The image of him sitting on the bed, his eyes shadowed with sorrow as he gazed at the photograph, lingered in her thoughts, stirring something deep and unsettling within her. She poured herself another glass of wine, sank into the couch and let her memories take her back in time. She remembered the first time she met Jack. He was a man brimming with confidence, ambition, and an undeniable magnetism that could draw anyone in. Their romance was swift and intoxicating, and within just a few months he proposed. At the time, Madison believed she had found her forever. But marriage slowly peeled back the layers of their whirlwind relationship, revealing truths she hadn't anticipated. Jack's obsession with perfection and his relentless pursuit of high expectations didn't just permeate his career, it extended to everyone around him, including her. Once, Madison had been vibrant and passionate, a woman full of life and creativity. Writing had been her escape, her joy, her way of connecting with the world. But life with Jack gradually stripped away those vital parts of her. He dismissed her writing as impractical, a frivolous pursuit that had no place in their structured life. Nights once spent with her pen and paper were replaced by dull evenings at his corporate dinners, or long hours listening to him talk about projects she couldn't bring herself to care about. Bit by bit, Madison felt herself fading, becoming the ideal wife in Jack's eyes but a stranger to her own reflection. Ethan came into her life not long after she married Jack. He was just 18 at the time, moving in with his father following the death of his mother. Madison vividly remembered the first time Ethan stepped into the house, his eyes swollen from crying too much, but his face set in a mask of stoic detachment. She had tried to bridge the gap between them, but Ethan kept his distance, as though afraid she might try to replace the mother he had lost. Over time, Madison realized Ethan and Jack shared one crucial trait, a suffocating suppression of their emotions. But unlike Jack, Ethan had no outlet for release. He bore the brunt of his father's expectations, academic excellence, professional aspirations, the impossible task of becoming Jack's idea of perfection. Ethan gave his best to meet those demands, but Madison could see how each effort chipped away at who he was, leaving a hollow shell of a boy who was just beginning to become a man. She thought of a night a few years ago when she had stumbled upon Ethan standing alone in the backyard. It was late, and the faint glow of the street lamp illuminated his silhouette as he strummed a weathered guitar. The melody was soft, melancholic, and hauntingly beautiful. For the first time, she saw Ethan expressing something raw and real. But when she called his name, he immediately stopped, packed up the guitar, and retreated to his room as though caught doing something forbidden. From that moment, Madison began to watch him more closely. She realized that beneath his stoic exterior, Ethan was a whirlwind of emotions struggling to find a voice. Madison sighed, her eyes resting on the wine glass in her hand. She understood Ethan's feelings better than anyone else because she was living through the same experience, trapped under the weight of expectations, suffocating in a life she hadn't chosen. The difference was that she had stopped fighting. She had resigned herself to this existence, believing it was all she would ever have. But Ethan was different. He still had time. He still had a spark within him, even if it was flickering. And that spark was what Madison couldn't look away from. As she sat there in the quiet of the living room, Madison realized that she and Ethan shared more than a home. They shared a pain, a sense of being stuck between who they were and who others expected them to be. In that moment, she knew their relationship had crossed into uncharted territory, a place where the lines between right and wrong blurred into a haze. But that only made her feel even more drawn to him, unable to resist the gravity pulling them together. The next night, Madison woke abruptly in the middle of her sleep, a heavy sense of unease pressing down on her chest. The clock on her bedside table read 2 a.m., but no matter how hard she tried, sleep eluded her. Thoughts of her stifling life, Jack's distant presence, and the sorrowful look in Ethan's eyes during their conversation the night before played on an endless loop in her mind. Unable to bear the weight of her thoughts, she decided to head to the kitchen for a cup of tea, hoping that the stillness of the night would quiet her restless heart. As she descended the stairs, a faint sound from the living room caught her attention. The dim glow of a lamp spilled out, and she noticed Ethan sitting on the couch, his back turned to her, shoulders hunched as if weighed down by the world. He was still wearing the same light grey t-shirt from earlier, his hair slightly disheveled, and beside him on the coffee table was a nearly empty bottle of red wine. Madison hesitated for a moment, torn between retreating and stepping forward, but then she moved. "Can't sleep either?" she asked softly, her voice careful, almost afraid to disturb the fragile quiet. Ethan flinched at her voice, turning his head in surprise, though his expression quickly softened. "What about you?" he replied, his voice raspy, as if he'd been having a long conversation with himself. She crossed the room and sat in the chair opposite him. "The night feels unusually long," Madison said, her gaze drifting to the bottle on the table. "Are you okay?" She didn't know why she asked, but the need to understand Ethan felt increasingly urgent. Ethan let out a faint laugh, though it carried no humour. "Too much on my mind," he admitted, his fingers tracing the edge of the table as though trying to ground himself. "My dad called tonight," he continued, his voice tight. "He wants me to change my major to business. Of course he does. It's the practical choice. But I don't want that." Madison felt her chest tighten. She wasn't surprised by Jack's demands, but the helplessness in Ethan's voice cut her deeper than she'd expected. "Did you tell him that?" she asked, leaning forward slightly, her eyes fixed on him. Ethan shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "What's the point? He doesn't listen. He never has. I'll never be good enough in his eyes. I'm just a failed copy of him." Madison stared at Ethan, his eyes brimming with the pain and anger he had kept buried for so long. In that moment, she didn't see a young man sitting before her. She saw someone crushed under the weight of unreasonable expectations, someone fighting the same invisible battle she had fought for years. She reached out instinctively, her hand resting lightly on his trembling one. "You don't have to be like your father. You don't have to live your life the way he wants. This life is yours, Ethan." Her words made him pause. Ethan looked down at her hand, her fingertips barely brushing against his skin. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Madison didn't pull away and Ethan didn't flinch. The space between them grew heavier, charged with something unspoken and undeniable, like a storm building on the horizon. "Madison," Ethan whispered, his voice trembling, not with fear, but with the weight of a decision he was still grappling with. Part of him wanted to step back, to protect the fragile boundary between them, but another part, buried deep within, longed to move closer. Madison knew she should pull her hand away, retreat upstairs and let everything stop there. But Ethan's eyes filled with pain and an aching need to be understood, held her in place. They stirred something inside her, a loneliness she had tried to bury long ago. In that moment, they were no longer stepmother and stepson. They were simply two lost souls, searching for a place to belong. Ethan leaned in, the hesitation fading as he placed his hand gently over hers, his fingers curling slightly as if seeking solace. Madison didn't move, didn't speak, but her breathing grew heavier. When their eyes met, time seemed to dissolve into the charged silence between them. "I know this is wrong," Ethan murmured, his voice a quiet confession. "But I can't stop myself. I can't stop thinking about you." Madison felt her throat tighten, her words caught somewhere between her mind and her heart. Before she could stop herself, she realized she had leaned in closer to him, the warmth radiating from his body erasing the distance that had once separated them. And then, their lips met, tentative at first, then urgent, a release of every suppressed emotion that had been building between them. In that moment, Madison knew they had crossed a line they could never uncross. But deep down, she also understood that this wasn't just a fleeting lapse in judgment. This was the beginning of something she couldn't yet name, something she wasn't sure she was ready to face. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a soft golden glow across the silent living room. Madison woke up on the sofa, a light blanket draped over her. For a fleeting moment, she thought everything had been a dream. But the warmth that lingered on her lips from Ethan's kiss the night before, and the chaotic pounding of her heart as their eyes had met, reminded her that it was anything but. Ethan had left before she awoke. She had no idea what he was thinking, but Madison didn't dare confront him, or herself. She threw herself into busywork around the house, desperately trying to push the events of the previous night to the back of her mind. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden chime of the doorbell. When she opened the door, her best friend Lily stood there, as bold and lively as always. She carried 2 steaming cups of coffee, but her keen eyes scanned Madison's face with suspicion. "You okay? You look different," Lily said, tilting her head slightly as she studied her friend. Madison shook her head quickly, forcing a weak smile, but Lily wasn't one to let things go so easily. Not long after, footsteps on the stairs announced Ethan's arrival. Madison froze where she stood, her heart hammering in her chest as if it might burst. Ethan's gaze flickered toward her, a hint of awkwardness crossing his face, but he masked it with a practiced nonchalance. Lily turned, her sharp eyes locking onto Ethan and then shifting back to Madison. She didn't say a word, but the air between the 3 of them thickened as Lily silently observed the tension Madison was trying so hard to hide. Ethan grabbed his keys, mumbled a quick goodbye, and left the house. As the door clicked shut, Lily sat down next to Madison, her expression a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "You can't hide from me, you know," Lily said, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "There's something going on between you and Ethan, isn't there?" Madison opened her mouth to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. Lily's gaze was piercing, as though she could see straight through the thin veil Madison had tried to drape over the truth. I don't know what to say," Madison finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Lily straightened up, her usually carefree demeanor replaced by a rare seriousness. She placed a firm hand on Madison's shoulder, her voice soft but unrelenting. "You know this can't continue, don't you? What if Jack finds out? What if Ethan gets hurt? Have you thought about the consequences of all this?" Lily's words hit Madison like a thunderclap. Everything she had been trying to bury in her mind surged forward, as if unleashed by the force of Lily's questions. She felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, staring into a chasm filled with consequences she couldn't yet fully comprehend. But before Madison could respond, the front door opened, and Jack walked in. Jack's presence filled the room like a sudden gust of icy wind. Madison stood up abruptly, her eyes wide with surprise. "You're home early?" she stammered, struggling to keep her voice steady. Jack smiled, but there was nothing warm about it. His eyes were sharp, cutting. "Work wrapped up sooner than expected," he said, his tone calm, though it carried an undercurrent of something much darker. Madison felt Jack's gaze linger on Lily, and then sweep across the room, taking in every detail. There was something unsettling in the way he looked around, as though he were piecing together a puzzle she couldn't see. "Where's Ethan?" Jack asked, his voice cold and even. Madison's pulse quickened. "He just stepped out," Lily answered quickly, trying to dispel the tension. But as soon as she spoke, Jack turned, his eyes locking onto Madison with a sharp intensity. "I feel like I've missed something," Jack said, his tone low and dangerous. Madison forced a smile, but it felt as though every layer of her was being stripped bare under his scrutiny. Lily quickly stood, muttered an excuse to leave, and slipped out the door, leaving Madison alone with Jack. Once Lily was gone, Jack stepped closer to Madison, his expression darker than she had ever seen it. "You're hiding something, aren't you?" he asked bluntly, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "There's nothing," she replied, but her voice wavered, betraying her. Jack stood there for a moment, his eyes boring into hers, as though searching for the truth buried beneath her words. "You and Ethan," he began, his voice quieter now, more dangerous. "There's something off, isn't there?" Madison didn't answer, but her silence spoke louder than words. Jack's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "I trusted you. I believed you would never betray me. But now, I'm not so sure." Madison felt as though her chest were caving in, her breath shallow and uneven. She couldn't deny it, but she couldn't bring herself to admit it either. The air in the room grew thick, suffocating. Jack turned away, walking to the window, his gaze distant and hard. If what I'm thinking is true, then everything between us ends here. His words struck like a hammer, leaving Madison reeling. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to salvage the pieces of the life she had so carelessly shattered. In that moment, she realized that everything was spiraling out of her control. The storm she had feared was no longer brewing, it had arrived, and it was only just beginning. Madison stood frozen in the living room as the door closed behind Jack. The echo of his footsteps faded, leaving her alone in a silence that now felt oppressive. His final words replayed in her mind, sharp and cutting, a cruel reminder that nothing could undo what had happened. Everything between her and Ethan had crossed a boundary, and now the consequences loomed closer, like an inevitable tidal wave crashing toward her. She sank onto the sofa, gripping the fabric of the cushions as she tried to steady her breathing. But fear, guilt, and an aching emptiness swirled inside her, refusing to let go. Madison didn't know how long she sat there, lost in her thoughts, but when she finally looked up, the light outside the window had dimmed to the grey hues of dusk. Part of her wanted to run, to leave everything behind, but another part knew she had to face this. She couldn't hide forever. Ethan returned when the sky was fully dark. He stepped into the house and found Madison sitting motionless on the sofa, her eyes red and puffy. Immediately sensing the heavy tension in the air, Ethan hesitated. "What happened?" he asked, his voice tinged with worry. Madison looked up at him, and as their eyes met, a surge of emotion rose in her chest, overwhelming and impossible to suppress. "Jack knows," she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan stood still, his body rigid with shock. He moved closer, sitting down beside her, but careful not to touch her as he normally might have. "What did he say?" he asked cautiously. Madison shook her head, trying to hold back the tears threatening to spill over. "He didn't say it outright, but he knows something's going on between us. He warned me. If it's true, everything is over." Her voice broke, and she turned to face Ethan, her eyes wide with fear. "And he's right. This isn't right. It never was." Ethan didn't respond immediately. His fists clenched tightly in his lap, his gaze fixed on the floor as he processed her words. "Madison," he started, but his voice faltered, unsure of what to say. "You don't have to say anything," Madison interrupted, her voice now steadier, more resolute. "We were wrong from the start, Ethan. I knew it then, and I know it now. But I let myself be led by feelings I shouldn't have had." Ethan turned to her, his eyes filled with a pain that was almost unbearable to see. "You're trying to push me away, aren't you?" he said, his voice raw. Madison drew in a deep breath, forcing herself to stay firm. "Not because I want to, but because we have to. I've already crossed too many lines. I've hurt Jack. I've hurt myself. And I'm terrified I'll end up hurting you too, Ethan." Her words hung heavily between them, filling the space with an oppressive weight. Ethan wanted to argue, to fight for what they had, but he couldn't ignore the truth in her voice. They had gone too far, and now the only thing left was the fallout. The next morning, Madison made her decision. She packed a small bag of essentials and left a letter on the kitchen counter. In it, she explained to Jack that she needed time and space to think clearly about everything. She didn't offer excuses or long-winded explanations, only an apology for the pain she had caused. As she stepped out the door, Madison felt a sharp, deep ache in her chest, but alongside it was a faint sense of relief. She knew this was the right thing to do. Ethan didn't try to stop her. He stood at the foot of the stairs, watching silently as she walked away. He wanted to call out, to run after her, but a part of him understood that this was the only way for both of them to find themselves again. As Madison drove off, Ethan turned back to the quiet house and went to his room. Sitting down next to the old guitar he had neglected for so long, he began to play, each note carrying pieces of emotions he couldn't put into words. Madison didn't look back as she drove away. She felt the weight of Ethan's gaze lingering on her, but she refused to let herself turn around. She needed this distance, this time to mend the wounds she had inflicted on herself and others. Yet deep down, she knew Ethan had changed her forever. He had reminded her of who she was, of what she had once longed for before becoming someone she no longer recognized. Time passed, and Madison began to rediscover herself in the quiet solitude she had chosen. She returned to writing, allowing herself to feel, to create, to embrace the emotions she had once buried out of fear. She didn't contact Jack or Ethan, but she carried them both in her heart as pieces of a story that had shaped her life in ways she couldn't deny. One late summer day, Madison received a letter from Ethan. It was brief, unadorned, but brimming with sincerity. "Thank you for helping me realize that sometimes freedom comes from letting go. I hope you find your own freedom too." As she finished reading, tears slid down her cheeks, quiet and unbidden. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in a journal where she kept the things most precious to her, a record of the journey that had brought her to where she was now. And then she moved forward. Not with Jack, not with Ethan, but with herself. It was a new path, one where she could reclaim what she had lost: hope, freedom, and the love she had always owed to herself.